My name is Sierra Sterling, and for 22 years, I was the daughter who stayed out of the way, the one who worked until her eyes burned under the fluorescent lights of the university library while the rest of the family celebrated my sister's existence. I am 22 years old, a senior biochemistry major at the University of Pennsylvania, and I have maintained a 3.9 GPA while balancing 16 credit hours and a part-time lab assistant position that pays a meager $22 an hour. On a Tuesday afternoon in late October, while the crisp Philadelphia wind rattled the windows of our family's estate in Rittenhouse Square, my mother, Eleanor Sterling, sat in her custom-upholstered velvet armchair and effectively ended my future. She held a crystal glass filled with a $14 pour of Santa Margherita Pinot Grigio, the condensation on the glass blurring the diamonds on her fingers as she looked at me with a mixture of boredom and irritation. I was standing on the Persian rug that cost more than my entire first year of schooling, clutching a crumpled, official-looking document in my trembling hands. It was a past-due tuition notice from the bursar's office, stating in cold black ink that the university had not received the final payment of $18,450 for my senior semester. If the balance wasn't settled within 48 hours, I would be barred from my labs, my credits would be frozen, and my 4 years of relentless, sleepless sacrifice would be reduced to nothing. I had asked her simply when the wire transfer from my trust fund would be completed, assuming it was a clerical error at the bank. My grandfather had set aside $75,000 for my education, a sum that was meant to be my safety net, my ticket to a PhD, and my independence. But as my mother took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, she didn't look surprised. She looked defensive. She told me, with a voice as smooth as the silk scarf around her neck, that there was no money left. She explained, as if she were talking about a minor weather delay, that my sister Chloe's wedding to a junior partner at a top-tier law firm required a certain level of prestige that my father's salary simply couldn't cover alone. Chloe, who had spent her 20s drifting from one failed social media influencer career to another, was apparently worth every cent of my future. My mother admitted, without a single tear or a hint of shame, that she had drained the entire $75,000 from my educational trust to pay for Chloe's custom-designed Vera Wang gown, which cost a staggering $26,000, and a 4-tier lobster and champagne dinner for 300 guests at the Bellevue Hotel. The air in the room felt heavy, smelling of expensive lilies and the faint, acidic scent of my mother's wine. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. I looked at the woman who had raised me, seeing the way she adjusted her Chanel cardigan, completely unbothered by the fact that she had stolen my life to buy my sister a dress she would wear for 8 hours. When I tried to speak, my voice was a broken whisper, asking how she could do this, how she could justify taking my degree away for a party. That was when she said it. She looked me in the eye and told me I was being incredibly selfish. She said a wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime milestone, a sacred family event, while my degree was just paperwork. To her, the late nights studying the molecular structures of proteins and the hundreds of hours spent in the lab were nothing compared to the optics of a high-society wedding. The hypocrisy of it was a physical blow. I had spent years wearing clothes from thrift stores and eating ramen in my dorm room to save every penny, while Chloe had been given a brand-new 2024 Mercedes-Benz GLE for her birthday just 6 months ago. The financial disparity was a constant, stinging reminder of my place in the Sterling hierarchy. My father, Marcus, a man who prided himself on his reputation as a pillar of the community, had clearly looked the other way while my mother forged the signatures required to move the funds. I knew how the accounts worked. I was a named beneficiary, and the trust was structured so that funds could only be released for educational expenses upon the presentation of a tuition bill. To get that $75,000 out, my mother hadn't just been creative with the budget. She had committed multiple counts of wire fraud and forgery, likely using the university's letterhead to create fake invoices. I stood there, my thumb tracing the embossed seal on the tuition notice, listening to the hum of the high-end HVAC system that kept the house at a perfect 68 degrees. I could hear the faint sound of a leaf blower outside, a gardener meticulously grooming the lawn for the pre-wedding brunch that was scheduled for the following morning. Every detail of this house, every luxury they enjoyed, felt like it was being paid for with my blood. My mother's indifference was the final catalyst. She didn't offer a loan. She didn't offer to sell one of her Birkin bags, which sat in a climate-controlled closet and were worth more than my missing tuition. She simply told me to get a student loan or ask a friend, as if $18,000 was something one could just find on the street. But she had forgotten one very important thing about her youngest daughter. I am a scientist. I am trained to observe, to document, and to understand the underlying mechanics of how things work. I don't act on emotion. I act on data. And the data in front of me suggested that my family had stopped being a family the moment they decided my brain was less valuable than my sister's vanity. As I walked out of that room, leaving my mother to finish her Pinot Grigio, I didn't head to my bedroom to cry. I headed to the small home office in the back of the house where my father kept his filing cabinets and his high-speed scanner. I knew the passwords. I knew the filing system. I spent the next 4 hours in a state of hyper-focused calm, my hands moving with the precision of someone titrating a sensitive chemical solution. I found the bank statements for the trust account. I found the digital trail of transfers, 6 separate withdrawals of $12,500 each, moved into a private checking account held only in my mother's name. I found the PDF files of the forged tuition invoices she had sent to the trust's executor, documents where she had clumsily used a basic photo editing tool to change the dates and amounts on my sophomore year bills. It was sloppy. It was arrogant. It was exactly the kind of mistake people make when they think the person they are robbing is too weak to fight back. By the time the sun began to set over the city, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the mahogany desk, I had a thumb drive filled with enough evidence to send my mother to a federal penitentiary and ruin my father's standing at the firm forever. I also had the guest list for the wedding, 400 of the most influential people in Pennsylvania, including the district attorney, several judges, and the very board members of the university who were currently threatening to kick me out. The wedding was 48 hours away. The lobster had been ordered, the Vera Wang gown was hanging in the guest suite upstairs, and the flowers, $10,000 worth of white peonies and orchids, were being loaded into refrigerated trucks at this very moment. My mother wanted a milestone. She wanted a day that no one would ever forget. She wanted a story that would be whispered about in the country clubs and the boardrooms for decades to come. As I tucked the thumb drive into the pocket of my worn-out lab coat, I felt a strange sense of peace. The girl who stayed out of the way was gone. In her place was a woman who realized that if her degree was just paperwork, then her family's reputation was just a house of cards. I walked back into the hallway, past the portrait of our family from 5 years ago, where we all looked so perfect, so united, so wealthy. I heard Chloe upstairs laughing loudly on the phone, likely complaining about the thread count of the linens for the bridal suite. I looked at my phone. It was 6:42 p.m. In 48 hours, the ceremony would begin. The music would swell, the doors would open, and the Sterling family would present their golden daughter to the world. And I would be there, not as a bridesmaid, not as a silent victim, but as the one who finally brought the truth into the light. My name is Sierra Sterling, and my family thinks they have already won. They have no idea that the most expensive part of this wedding hasn't even been billed yet. They think they've traded my future for a dress, but they've actually traded their freedom for a headline. I am going to ensure that Chloe's walk down the aisle is the last time this family ever walks anywhere with their heads held high. The paperwork they find so trivial is about to become the most important thing in their lives. I didn't choose this war, but I am certainly going to be the one who finishes it. Family isn't about the name on a trust fund or the blood in your veins. It's about who doesn't steal your life when you're not looking. And as I stepped out into the cold October night, heading toward the nearest FedEx office to print out the final pieces of my plan, I knew that for the Sterlings, the party was already over. The financial gap in our family home was not just a disparity in bank balances, but a canyon that swallowed every ounce of my self-worth for years, while my sister, Brianna, was elevated to the status of a local deity. My sister is 26 years old and lives in a $3,200 a month luxury influencer loft in the heart of downtown Chicago, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick that was entirely funded by what my parents call loans, but what everyone with a basic understanding of mathematics knows are permanent gifts that will never be repaid. As I stood in our kitchen, still reeling from the news about my trust fund, I could see Brianna's social media feed on the iPad left on the granite counter, showing her posing in a mirror while wearing a $6,200 Cartier love bracelet that caught the morning light with a sickeningly bright glint. This is the same sister who, despite having no discernible career beyond posting filtered photos of her avocado toast and high-end skincare routines, received a constant stream of wire transfers from our father's business account to maintain her aesthetic lifestyle. Meanwhile, I spent my junior and senior years working 30 hours a week at a greasy campus diner where the smell of old fryer oil and burnt coffee seemed to seep into my very pores, a scent I could never quite wash away no matter how long I stood under the lukewarm water of my dorm shower. I wore thrifted scrubs that were 2 sizes too large and faded at the knees because I couldn't afford the official university-branded laboratory gear, and I spent my nights praying that my 2009 midnight blue Ford Focus would actually start when I turned the key in the ignition. The car had a faulty alternator that caused the headlights to flicker rhythmically like a dying heartbeat every time I drove home from a late-night shift, and the interior smelled of damp floor mats and the cheap air freshener I used to mask the aroma of the diner. My parents, Robert and Diane Sterling, were people who obsessed over their country club image with a fervor that bordered on the religious, prioritizing the optics of wealth over the actual stability of their children's futures. They didn't mind that their youngest daughter was driving a vehicle that was a literal safety hazard on the highway, yet they spent $450 every single month on professional lawn maintenance to ensure that the Kentucky bluegrass of our Rittenhouse Square estate was trimmed to a precise 2-inch height. My father would stand at the window in his hand-tailored Italian wool suit, nodding with approval as the landscaping crew meticulously edged the flower beds, while simultaneously telling me over dinner that I needed to be more proactive and apply for more grants to cover my basic lab fees. He said it with a straight face, as if he weren't currently paying for a custom-built walk-in humidor in his basement or a wine cellar that held thousands of dollars in vintage Bordeaux. When I mentioned that the $300 lab fee for my organic chemistry research project was due, my mother would just sigh and look at her reflection in the polished silverware, suggesting that perhaps I should look into another work-study position or cut back on my personal expenses, which were already non-existent. I didn't have a social life, I didn't have a gym membership, and I certainly didn't have a $6,000 bracelet. I had a stack of textbooks and a pair of worn-out sneakers that I had glued back together twice with industrial-strength adhesive from the chemistry department. The sheer audacity of their financial neglect became a physical weight as I sat in the dim light of my father's office later that evening, the silent hum of the high-speed scanner the only sound in the room besides the ticking of a $5,000 grandfather clock in the hallway. I thought about the time Brianna crashed her first car, a brand-new BMW, and my father replaced it within 48 hours with a 2024 Mercedes-Benz GLE, telling her that mistakes happen and she deserved to feel safe on the road. When my Ford Focus broke down on the Schuylkill Expressway during a rainstorm, my mother told me that I should call AAA and that it was a good lesson in self-reliance and character building. The contrast was a sharp, jagged glass in my throat, a reminder that my parents didn't see me as a daughter to be supported, but as a burden to be managed, a secondary character in the grand production of Brianna's perfect life. They viewed my academic success as a given, something that didn't require investment because I was the responsible one, the smart one, the one who didn't cause drama. They used my stability as an excuse to ignore my needs, effectively punishing me for being the only person in the family with a grasp on reality. I looked at the receipts I was scanning, seeing the line items for the wedding that had drained my education. There was a bill for a floral arrangement of white peonies and ranunculus that cost more than my entire sophomore year of room and board. There was a deposit for a string quartet that would play for exactly 45 minutes during the ceremony, an amount that would have covered my biochemistry textbooks for the next 3 years. My mother's handwriting was all over the margins of these bills, noting things like more gold leaf on the cake or upgraded silk ribbons for the programs. She was meticulously building a fantasy world for Brianna while dismantling the actual world I had worked so hard to construct for myself. I remembered my father's voice from earlier that year, lecturing me about the importance of fiscal responsibility when I asked for help with a particularly expensive medical insurance payment, yet here he was, signing off on a $10,000 ice sculpture of a swan for a reception that would last 4 hours. The hyper-realism of my life was found in these small, cruel details. The way my mother would tell me to find a coupon for my groceries while she bought a $200 bottle of perfume on a whim at Neiman Marcus. The way my father would brag to his business associates about his daughter the scientist, using my hard work as a prop for his own ego, while never actually knowing the name of my thesis or the fact that I was currently being threatened with academic dismissal. They loved the idea of me, but they hated the reality of me, the girl who reminded them that life wasn't just gala invitations and country club luncheons. As the scanner light slid across the forged bank documents, I felt a sense of cold, clinical detachment. I was no longer the daughter trying to please her parents. I was an analyst examining a corrupt system that was destined to fail. The $26,000 Vera Wang gown was not just a dress. It was a monument to their vanity, built on the ruins of my senior year. Every time I looked at my sister, I saw a person who had never known the panicked calculation of checking a bank balance before buying a gallon of milk. Brianna lived in a world of soft lighting and filtered aesthetics, her Chicago loft filled with mid-century modern furniture that my parents had shipped to her as a housewarming gift. I lived in a world of stark, white laboratory light and the harsh reality of $18,000 in debt that wasn't even mine. My sister's problems were always treated as emergencies that required immediate financial intervention. A broken laptop, a missed flight, a bad breakup that required a week-long spa retreat in Sedona. My problems, the real ones involving my education and my future, were treated as inconveniences that I was expected to solve on my own, with grit and determination. The injustice of it was so thick I could almost taste it, like the metallic tang of a penny. I realized then that my parents didn't value my degree because they couldn't post it on Instagram and get 3,000 likes. They couldn't wear my GPA to a cocktail party and have people envy them. They wanted the wedding because it was a public display of their success, a crowning achievement in their social narrative. They were willing to commit federal crimes to ensure that the sterling name remained synonymous with luxury, never once considering that the person they were stepping on was the only one who actually knew how to save them. As I saved the final file to the encrypted thumb drive, I thought about my 2009 Ford Focus parked in the driveway, its paint peeling and its engine rattling, and I compared it to the 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country that my father had just bought for himself. I realized that the only way to bridge the canyon between us was to let the whole thing collapse. They had spent years building an image of a perfect, wealthy family, and they had used my future as the foundation. But foundations are meant to be solid, and when you strip them for parts to buy silk and lobster, the structure becomes unstable. I wasn't just a biochemistry major, I was the one who understood the chemistry of their downfall. I was the one who knew exactly which catalyst to add to make the whole thing explode. I was the daughter who worked 30 hours a week in a greasy diner, and I was about to serve them a bill they would never be able to pay. The night air outside the office window was cold, and I could hear the distant sound of the city, a reminder of the world that existed outside of this Rittenhouse Square bubble. In 48 hours, the Bellevue Hotel would be filled with the elite of Philadelphia, all there to celebrate a union built on stolen money and forged signatures. I would be there too, but I wouldn't be wearing a bridesmaid's dress or a fake smile. I would be wearing the truth, and it would be the most expensive thing in the room. I felt a strange sense of empowerment as I shut down the computer, the screen fading to black. My parents thought they had handled me, that I would just slink away and find a loan and be grateful for the scraps they left behind. They didn't realize that when you take everything from someone who has nothing left to lose, you give them a dangerous kind of freedom. I had no tuition, no trust fund, and no family that cared if I succeeded or failed. All I had was the evidence of their crimes and a mind sharp enough to use it. The Sterling family was about to learn that you can't buy your way out of a federal investigation, and you certainly can't replace a daughter's future with a custom-designed gown. The canyon between us was deep, but I was the only one who knew how to climb out. And as I walked toward my bedroom to pack a bag, I didn't look back at the portraits or the expensive furniture. I looked forward to the moment the music stopped and the real paperwork began. The betrayal reached its absolute suffocating peak on the evening of July 14th, precisely at 6:45 p.m., a moment etched into my memory with the clinical clarity of a lab report. The air in my father's study was thick and stagnant, heavy with the cloying, prestigious scent of expensive Cohiba cigar smoke that seemed to coat the mahogany bookshelves and the leather-bound volumes like a layer of fine dust. I stood before his heavy oak desk, my fingers trembling slightly as I held a pen and a notepad, prepared to finally receive the routing number to my late grandmother's educational trust fund so I could settle the outstanding balance on my senior year tuition. My father, Robert Sterling, was reclined in his high-backed ergonomic chair, his face obscured by the sprawling pages of the Wall Street Journal, the crisp paper snapping occasionally as he adjusted his grip. He didn't even bother to lower the newspaper to look me in the eye when I asked for the information, treating my presence as if I were a minor interruption in his evening market analysis. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of any tremor or guilt, carrying the flat, authoritative tone he used when dismissing a low-level employee at his firm. He told me quite simply that the account had been settled and that there was no longer a routing number to provide because the remaining $75,612 had already been liquidated. He explained, with a chilling lack of empathy, that the family had made a collective decision to reallocate those funds to cover the final installments for Brianna's floral arrangements and the grand ballroom rental at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Philadelphia. I felt the blood drain from my face, the silence in the room suddenly amplified by the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the mantel and the distant, muffled sound of the gardener's shears outside. To my father, $75,000 was a figure on a ledger, a convenient surplus that could be moved from my future to my sister's vanity without a second thought. But to me, it was the sum of every late-night study session and every sacrifice I had made to ensure I could escape the shadow of this house. As I stood there, frozen by the sheer magnitude of their theft, my sister Brianna leaned against the doorframe, a picture of effortless, stolen luxury in her silk lounge set. She reached up to adjust her $400 hand-tied hair extensions, her fingers catching the light with the sparkle of her diamond rings, and she let out a short, airy laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt, her eyes scanning my thrifted clothes and the exhaustion written on my face before she told me that I was making a scene over nothing. She suggested, with a casual cruelty that made my skin crawl, that if I was so desperate for money, I could always just wait tables for another year or perhaps take on extra shifts at the diner to cover the difference. The phrase family decision echoed in my mind, a bitter irony considering I was the only member of the family who hadn't been consulted or even informed that my life savings were being used to pay for thousands of white orchids and gold-leafed centerpieces. My mother, Diane, was seated on the velvet settee near the window, meticulously organizing a stack of heavy, cream-colored wedding invitations, her gold fountain pen moving with elegant precision. She didn't look up either, her silence serving as a tacit endorsement of my father's betrayal. Her focus entirely remained on the aesthetics of the upcoming social event, rather than the survival of her youngest daughter's career. The room felt smaller, the expensive cigar smoke becoming a physical barrier that separated them from me, a cloud of arrogance that masked the fact that they were, in every legal sense, common thieves who had forged my grandmother's intent to satisfy their own social climbing. No one looked me in the eye because they couldn't bear to see the reflection of their own moral bankruptcy in the face of the person they were currently destroying, yet they maintained the facade of the respectable Sterling family with a terrifying level of commitment. They truly believed that because I had always been the quiet one, the one who worked hard and didn't demand the spotlight, I would simply roll over and accept this final indignity as I had accepted so many others. They thought I was a pushover, a secondary character whose only purpose was to provide a background of academic achievement that they could brag about at the club while they simultaneously hollowed out my soul. My father finally lowered his newspaper, but only to tap the ash from his cigar into a crystal tray, his expression one of mild annoyance that I was still standing there, waiting for an apology that would never come. He told me that Brianna's wedding was a milestone for the entire family name, a strategic social investment that would pay dividends in prestige and connections, whereas my biochemistry degree was a personal pursuit that could be delayed or financed through other means. He spoke about the $26,000 Vera Wang gown and the 4-tier lobster dinner as if they were essential infrastructure projects, while my $18,000 tuition bill was treated like a frivolous luxury he could no longer afford to subsidize. The hyper-realism of the moment was suffocating, the way the gold leaf on the picture frames seemed to glow with a sickly light, the precise clink of my mother's pen against the glass desk, and the faint scent of the expensive lilies that had already begun arriving at the house. I looked at Brianna, who was now checking her reflection in the polished surface of a silver tray, completely unbothered by the fact that she was wearing my medical school applications and my senior research project on her back. She was the golden child, the influencer whose life was a series of curated moments, while I was the girl who understood that under the filters and the expensive lighting, my family was rotting from the inside out. I realized then that they weren't just taking my money, they were taking my time, the one thing I could never get back, forcing me to restart my life from zero while they celebrated their once-in-a-lifetime milestone on a foundation of lies. The financial gap between us had never felt more like a physical barrier. My parents were willing to spend $450 a month on lawn maintenance and thousands on floral arrangements that would wilt within 48 hours. But they wouldn't spend a single cent to keep me from being barred from my graduation. My father's 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country sat in the driveway, a $60,000 monument to his ego, while I was expected to drive a car with a faulty alternator and a dying battery until I could earn my way out of the hole they had dug for me. The injustice of it was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, a realization that the people who were supposed to be my protectors were actually my primary predators. As I stood in that smoke-filled room, watching my mother obsess over the calligraphy on an invitation to a judge who didn't even know her name, I felt the last vestige of my loyalty snap like a brittle twig. They didn't know that I had spent the last 3 nights in the university computer lab, using my access to forensic software to trace the digital footprints of every transfer they had made from my grandmother's trust. They didn't know that I had recorded the entire conversation on the phone in my pocket, capturing my father's confession about the $75,000 and his admission that it was a family decision to use my educational funds for a party. They didn't know that I had already contacted the trust's executor, a man who had been a dear friend of my grandmother and who would be horrified to learn that the money meant for a woman of science had been spent on silk ribbons and lobster tails. To them, I was just Sierra, the quiet girl who liked books and didn't cause trouble, but to the federal authorities who oversee trust fraud and embezzlement, I was about to become the star witness in a case that would strip the Sterling name of every ounce of prestige it possessed. I looked at Brianna one last time, her $400 hair extensions swaying as she turned to leave the room, her laughter echoing down the hallway like a taunt. She thought she was going to have the wedding of the century at the Ritz, a fairy tale evening documented by a team of professional photographers and shared with her thousands of followers. She had no idea that the most important guest at her wedding wouldn't be a socialite or a law partner, but the truth. And it would arrive in the form of a legal injunction that would freeze their assets before the first course was even served. My father picked up his Wall Street Journal again, the paper rustling as he returned to his world of stocks and bonds, effectively erasing me from the room. He thought he had settled the account, but he had only just opened it, and the interest on his betrayal was going to be more than he could ever pay. As I walked out of the study, the smell of cigar smoke clinging to my hair and my clothes like a shroud, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a technician preparing for a high-stakes experiment, one where the variables were finally under my control. I walked past the portraits of my ancestors, men and women who had built this family on hard work and integrity, and I wondered what they would think of the hollow shells my parents had become. The Rittenhouse Square estate, with its perfect lawn and its climate-controlled wine cellar, was a tomb for their morality, and I was the only one with the key to the door. I went to my room, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes as I began to draft the final emails that would set the gears of justice in motion. July 14th, 6:45 p.m., was the moment the Sterling family decided I wasn't worth my own future. And it was the moment I decided they weren't worth their own reputation. The party was 2 days away, and while they were counting the number of peonies in each bouquet, I was counting the number of years my father would likely spend in a minimum security prison for wire fraud. They wanted a milestone, and I was going to give them one. The day the girl they thought was a pushover became the one who pushed back with the full weight of the law behind her. Family isn't about the blood you share or the house you live in. It's about the respect you give to the dreams of the people you claim to love. And in the Sterling house, the only thing they loved was the image in the mirror, an image that was about to be shattered into 10,000 pieces. I sat in the driver's seat of my 2009 midnight blue Ford Focus, the engine idling with a rough, rhythmic shudder that vibrated through the steering wheel and into my very bones, parked under the harsh, buzzing glow of a 24-hour Dunkin' on the outskirts of Philadelphia at precisely 2:14 in the morning. The world outside was a desolate landscape of wet asphalt and long shadows, illuminated only by the aggressive flickering of the pink and orange neon sign that hummed with a high-pitched electrical frequency, casting a sickly, strobing light across my dashboard. I was surrounded by the debris of a life lived on the margins of my own family's luxury. A crumpled fast food wrapper, a stack of organic chemistry flashcards, and the heavy, cold weight of the realization that my parents had effectively erased my future to pay for a weekend of social theater. The interior of the car smelled faintly of old coffee and the ozone scent of the faulty alternator that I couldn't afford to fix, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled, lavender-scented hallways of the Rittenhouse Square estate I had just fled. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a single thin paper napkin and a black ballpoint pen that I had taken from the university lab, my hands moving with a clinical, detached precision as I cleared a space on the passenger seat to begin the most important calculation of my life. I sat there in the silence of the pre-dawn hours, the only sound being the distant hiss of traffic on the interstate and the occasional click of the neon sign, and I began to list the cold, hard facts of my existence on that flimsy piece of paper. Fact number 1 was that the educational trust fund established by my late grandmother, Margaret Sterling, was legally classified as a restricted asset, a designation that meant the funds were strictly earmarked for tuition, books, and academic fees, and were never intended to be accessible for personal expenses or family events. Fact number 2 was even more damning, a detail I remembered from the brief meeting I had with the estate attorney when I turned 18, which specified that my physical notarized signature was an absolute legal requirement for any withdrawal or transfer exceeding $5,000. Fact number 3 was the final nail in the coffin of my relationship with my parents. I had never, not once in my entire life, signed a single document authorizing the release of $75,000, nor had I ever been presented with a request to do so. As I stared at those 3 lines of text, the ink bleeding slightly into the soft fibers of the napkin, the truth crystallized in my mind with the terrifying clarity of a chemical reaction reaching its tipping point. My mother hadn't just taken the money in a moment of financial desperation, and she hadn't just exercised poor judgment in the face of my sister's extravagant demands. She had committed multiple counts of felony forgery and wire fraud. To move $62,000 into a private checking account and then distribute it to vendors like the Ritz-Carlton and Vera Wang, she would have had to physically recreate my signature on at least a dozen different authorization forms, likely using the university's own letterhead as a shield to deceive the trust's executor. She had sat at her antique writing desk, perhaps sipping that same $14 Pinot Grigio, and meticulously traced my name over and over again, effectively stealing my identity while I was across town, working a double shift at a greasy diner to pay for the very books she was stealing from me. The love I had carried for them, a fragile, battered thing that had survived years of neglect and secondary status, died right there at that plastic table in a flickering Dunkin' parking lot. It wasn't a dramatic or loud death. It was a silent, sudden extinguishing of a flame, leaving behind nothing but the cold, gray ash of analytical resolve. I realized in that moment that I no longer needed a mother to comfort me or a father to provide for me, because those roles had been vacated long ago by the people living in the Rittenhouse Square mansion. I didn't need a family to celebrate my graduation or a sister to stand by my side. What I needed was a forensic auditor and a federal prosecutor who understood the gravity of the documents I was currently mentally cataloging. The Sterling name, which my father spent $450 a month on lawn maintenance to protect, was now nothing more than a lead on a criminal investigation, and the home I had grown up in was just a crime scene waiting to be processed. The hyper-realism of my situation was found in the small, jagged details of my surroundings, the way the fluorescent light inside the Dunkin' reflected off the chrome of a passing truck, and the precise, mechanical way I began to plan the systematic dismantling of their lives. I thought about the $18,450 I owed the university, a sum that felt like a mountain to me but was less than the cost of the white peonies currently being chilled for my sister's reception. I thought about the $400 hair extensions Brianna had adjusted with such casual arrogance, and I realized that every single strand of that hair was paid for with a forged signature that was supposed to be my ticket to a medical career. The injustice of it was no longer an emotional burden. It was a set of data points that I could use to construct a narrative for the authorities, a story of a daughter whose own parents treated her like an inconvenient line item in a social budget. I looked at the napkin again, the black ink stark against the white paper, and I felt a sense of empowerment that I had never experienced in 22 years of being the quiet Sterling. My parents had made the mistake of raising a scientist, a woman trained to look past the surface of things to find the underlying truth, and they had forgotten that I was the one who kept the records while they were busy chasing the ghost of their own prestige. They thought I would be too ashamed or too broken to fight back, that the fear of a family scandal would keep me silent while they paraded Brianna down the aisle in a $26,000 gown bought with my blood. But they had underestimated the sheer, cold fury of a person who has been shown that their life is worth less than a lobster dinner. I wasn't going to cry, and I wasn't going to beg for a loan that I would be expected to pay back with interest while they lived in luxury. I reached for my phone, the screen illuminating my face with a pale blue light, and I began to scroll through my contacts until I found the number for the lead investigator at the regional office of the FBI, a man whose daughter I had tutored in chemistry the previous semester. It was 2:26 in the morning, far too early to call, but it was the perfect time to begin the digital paper trail that would lead to my mother's doorstep. I began to draft an email, my fingers flying across the screen with the same precision I used when measuring reagents in the lab, detailing the specific accounts, the dates of the transfers, and the fact that I had evidence of forged signatures on documents used to bypass a restricted educational trust. I described the 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country sitting in our driveway and the designer clothes in my sister's downtown loft, providing a roadmap for an asset seizure that would leave the Sterlings with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The betrayal on July 14th at 6:45 p.m. had been the catalyst, but this moment in the Dunkin' parking lot was the reaction. I was no longer a victim of their narcissism. I was the architect of their accountability. As the sun began to peek over the horizon in a thin, gray line of light, I felt a strange sense of peace, a realization that the Sterling family name was about to become synonymous with something much more permanent than a high society wedding. They wanted a milestone, a day that would be talked about for years, and I was going to ensure they got exactly what they asked for. The ceremony would still happen. The guests would still arrive in their fine silks and expensive suits, but the music they would hear wouldn't be a string quartet. It would be the sound of a world collapsing, one forged signature at a time. I folded the napkin carefully and tucked it into the pocket of my thrifted scrubs, a small piece of evidence that weighed more than all the gold in my father's wine cellar. I wasn't just a biochemistry major anymore. I was a woman who had realized that when the people who are supposed to love you become your predators, you have every right to become the hunter. The party was starting in less than 48 hours, and I was going to be the most prepared person in the room. Family isn't about blood. It's about the signatures you don't forge and the futures you don't steal. And as I put my car into gear and pulled out of the parking lot, the faulty alternator whining in the morning air, I knew that for the first time in my life, I was the one who held all the power. I was going to show them that paperwork wasn't just a formality, it was the weapon that was going to take everything from them. I didn't reach out to a lawyer immediately because I knew that in the high-stakes world of the Philadelphia elite, lawyers were often friends with other lawyers, and my father's influence at his firm could easily stifle a preliminary inquiry before it ever gained traction. Instead, I relied on the one person who had seen me come home in tears after every failed attempt to reason with my parents, my roommate and closest friend, Chloe, who happened to work as a lead teller at the First National Bank branch where my grandmother's trust was held. Chloe had spent years watching me survive on ramen and diner tips, while my sister Brianna flaunted her designer lifestyle, and when I showed her the napkin from Dunkin' at 3 o'clock in the morning, her face went from sleepy confusion to a cold, professional mask of fury. By the time Friday afternoon rolled around and the city was buzzing with the arrival of wedding guests for the Sterling Vaughan Union, I was sitting in the back of a quiet university study lounge with a thick, heavy manila folder that felt like a loaded weapon in my hands. Inside that folder was the anatomy of a betrayal so precise and documented that it left no room for the silver-tongued excuses my father usually used to navigate his way out of trouble. The first item in the folder was a set of high-resolution photocopies of the actual withdrawal slips used to drain the $75,612 from my grandmother's restricted educational account. As I looked at them under the harsh LED lights of the lounge, I felt a physical wave of nausea because the forgery was so laughably bad that it was an insult to my intelligence. My mother, Diane, hadn't even tried to mimic the sharp, slanted way I cross my T's or the specific looped way I finish the letter S. She had simply written my name in a flowery, haughty cursive that looked exactly like her own handwriting on a dinner party invitation. It was the signature of a woman who was so certain of her own untouchable status that she didn't believe anyone would ever actually look at the paperwork, assuming that her last name and her social standing were enough to bypass the most basic protocols of the American banking system. She had signed my life away with a flourish of a fountain pen, likely while checking her watch to see if she would be late for her Pilates class or a bridal fitting. The second item was even more damning. A thumb drive containing time-stamped security footage from June 12th at precisely 10:42 in the morning, the day the primary wire transfer had been initiated to cover the deposit for the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. In the grainy but clear digital recording, I could see my mother dressed in a cream-colored linen suit, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, sitting in the glass-walled office of the bank manager, Mr. Henderson. They weren't just conducting business, they were laughing. Mr. Henderson, a man who had attended my father's annual holiday parties for a decade, was leaning back in his chair, sharing a joke with my mother as he pushed the transfer documents across the desk for her to sign. There was no scrutiny of the restricted trust status, no request for a secondary ID, and certainly no phone call to the 22-year-old beneficiary whose entire future was being liquidated in a single mouse click. They were two members of the same exclusive club, quietly collaborating to ensure that the sterling daughter who mattered was given the wedding she deserved, regardless of the laws they were breaking in the process. The final piece of the trap was a formal notarized statement from a certified forensic handwriting expert whom I had hired for $850, money I had painstakingly scraped together from my last 3 months of diner shifts, sacrificing my own grocery budget to ensure I had an objective, professional opinion that could stand up in a court of law. The expert's report was 12 pages of devastating analysis, using microscopic comparisons to prove that the person who signed the June 12th withdrawal slips was the same person who had signed my mother's own mortgage documents and country club membership renewals. He used terms like line quality, pen pressure, and terminal strokes to demonstrate that there was a 0% chance the signatures were mine. It was a clinical, undeniable indictment of my mother's criminality, wrapped in the cold language of forensic science, and it was the one thing my father's reputation couldn't buy its way out of. The trap was now fully set, and the hyper-realism of my preparations felt like a shield against the emotional devastation of knowing my parents had conspired with their friends to rob me. I spent the rest of that Friday evening meticulously organizing the digital files, creating multiple encrypted backups, and scheduling an automated email to be sent to the university's Board of Trustees and the regional office of the FBI if I didn't check in by a certain time the following day. I thought about the $3,200 a month loft my sister Brianna occupied in Chicago, a space filled with curated art and high-end furniture, and I compared it to the cramped, dusty corner of the library where I was currently planning the downfall of my own family. I thought about the black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country my father drove, a vehicle that cost more than my entire 4-year education, and I realized that every luxury they enjoyed was a result of the same arrogance that had led them to believe they could forge my signature with impunity. Every detail of their world was about to be scrutinized under the same microscopic lens I used in my biochemistry labs. The white peonies that cost $10,000, the $26,000 Vera Wang gown, and the 4-tier lobster dinner were no longer symbols of a milestone. They were now evidence of the misappropriation of funds. I could almost hear the sound of the string quartet practicing for the ceremony, the elegant notes of Pachelbel's canon echoing through the ballroom of the Ritz, and I knew that within 24 hours, that music would be replaced by the much harsher sound of federal investigators asking for my mother's identification. I felt a strange, cold sense of satisfaction as I tucked the manila folder into my backpack, the weight of the paper a constant reminder that I was no longer a victim. I was the one who had documented the crime, I was the one who had hired the expert, and I was the one who was going to pull the cord on the entire sterling facade. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the study lounge, seeing the dark circles under my eyes and the way my thrifted scrubs hung off my frame. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the lesser daughter. I felt like the only one in the family who actually understood the value of a signature and the weight of a promise. My mother had treated my degree like a piece of paperwork, a triviality that could be discarded in favor of a party. But she was about to learn that paperwork is the very thing that keeps people like her in expensive velvet armchairs or puts them in federal orange jumpsuits. Mr. Henderson at the bank was going to learn that a decade of country club lunches didn't protect him from the liability of processing a fraudulent wire transfer on a restricted account. And my father, who sat in his smoke-filled office talking about family decisions, was about to discover that his youngest daughter had made a decision of her own. a decision to stop being a footnote in his social narrative. The silence of the university campus at night was a stark contrast to the chaotic, entitled energy of the Sterling house. As I walked back to my car, the faulty alternator whining as I started the engine, I felt a clarity of purpose that was almost spiritual. I wasn't doing this for revenge, though the sting of their betrayal still burned in my chest. I was doing this for justice, for the girl who worked 30 hours a week in a greasy diner while her sister wore a $6,000 bracelet, and for the grandmother who had wanted her money to build a scientist, not a ballroom filled with wilted flowers. Family isn't a license to steal, and it isn't a shield against the consequences of your own narcissism. The Sterlings had spent 22 years teaching me that I didn't count, that my dreams were secondary to their image, and that my future was a resource they could harvest whenever they needed to buy more prestige. They had spent years building a canyon between us, but they had forgotten that I was the one who knew how to measure the depth of the fall. As I drove away from the campus, the flickering neon of the city lights reflecting off my windshield, I knew that the next time I saw my mother, it wouldn't be at a wedding rehearsal or a family dinner. It would be in a room where her Pinot Grigio and her Chanel cardigan wouldn't be able to save her from the truth contained in my manila folder. The trap was set, the evidence was undeniable, and the girl who was just paperwork was about to become the most important person in the history of the Sterling family's demise. I was ready for the wedding, but not for the reasons anyone expected. I was going to ensure that the big day was indeed a once-in-a-lifetime milestone, the day the Sterlings finally lost everything they had stolen. The evening of the wedding was a masterclass in performative wealth, a $120,000 circus that felt more like a corporate branding event than a celebration of love, held within the suffocatingly ornate confines of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. Outside, the Philadelphia air was a thick, humid soup of 88 degrees that threatened to wilt the $1,000 floral arrangements arriving at the curb. But inside the grand ballroom, the climate control was set to a crisp 66 degrees, creating a sanctuary of artificial perfection. It was precisely 8:30 p.m., the golden hour of the reception, and the entire room was bathed in the ethereal, expensive glow of $15,000 worth of custom-installed fairy lights that draped from the gilded ceiling like weeping willow branches made of stardust. The scent of seared sea bass and expensive lilies hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sharp, acidic bite of the vintage champagne that was being poured into 300 crystal flutes for the upcoming toast. My parents, Robert and Diane Sterling, stood at the head table like monarchs presiding over a conquered territory, their faces radiating a toxic level of prestige as they whispered to a state senator and adjusted the silk napkins on their laps. They were basking in the glow of the social capital they had purchased with my future, completely oblivious to the fact that the girl they had erased from the narrative was no longer content to stay in the shadows of the laboratory. I walked into the ballroom not through the main entrance where the tuxedoed ushers were stationed, but through the service doors used by the catering staff, my footsteps silent on the thick, plush carpeting that had been vacuumed into perfect geometric lines. I wasn't wearing the apricot-colored silk bridesmaid dress that my mother had tried to force upon me, a dress that would have cost me another $900 out of pocket. Instead, I was wearing a sharp, tailored midnight blue blazer and matching trousers, an outfit that made me look less like a member of the wedding party and more like a high-stakes process server or a federal auditor. My hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun, and my expression was one of clinical, detached observation as I scanned the room, noting the exact positions of the bank manager, Mr. Henderson, and the university board members who were currently laughing at my father's jokes. I wasn't holding a flute of bubbly or a plate of hors d'oeuvres. I was holding a heavy, rectangular weight in my arms, a stack of 280 professionally printed flyers, each one a high-gloss indictment of the Sterling family's criminal enterprise. The hyper-realism of the moment was overwhelming, a sensory overload of clinking silver, hushed laughter, and the soft, rhythmic hum of the industrial air conditioning system that fought against the August heat. I could see my sister Brianna at the center of the room, her $26,000 Vera Wang gown sprawling across the dance floor like a white silk ink blot, her $6,000 Cartier love bracelet catching the flicker of the fairy lights as she gestured toward the four-tier lobster dinner being served. She looked like a queen, but to me, she looked like a thief wearing the stolen proceeds of my senior year. My father stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his glass to signal the start of the toasts, the sound ringing out with a sharp, clear frequency that sliced through the ambient noise of the ballroom. He began to speak about the importance of family, about the legacy of the sterling name, and about the bright futures that awaited his children, his voice steady and full of the unearned confidence of a man who believes his own lies. He spoke about Brianna's vision and her success, while my mother looked on with tears of manufactured joy in her eyes, her hand resting on a designer clutch that likely contained the very pen she had used to forge my signature. I waited until he reached the crescendo of his speech, the moment where he asked everyone to raise their glasses to the happy couple, and then I moved. I didn't scream, and I didn't make a scene. I simply began to walk among the tables, my midnight blue blazer a dark streak against the sea of pastel silks and black tuxedos. With the methodical precision of a lab technician distributing samples, I placed a flyer in front of every single guest, the heavy cardstock landing on the white linen tablecloths with a soft, final thud. People looked down, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they realized that the flyer wasn't a program or a menu, but a detailed forensic breakdown of the $75,612 that had been embezzled from a restricted trust to pay for the very seat they were sitting in. The flyer featured a side-by-side comparison of my actual signature and the laughably bad forgery my mother had provided to the bank, along with a QR code that linked directly to the security footage of Mr. Henderson and my mother laughing while they processed the fraudulent wire transfer. The room began to go silent in waves, the ripples of realization spreading from the back tables toward the front as guests began to whisper and point, the prestige my parents had spent so much to cultivate evaporating in the cold light of the truth. I reached the head table just as my father was finishing his sentence about the integrity of the Sterling bloodline, and I placed the final 3 flyers directly in front of him, my mother, and Brianna. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the faint, distant sound of a siren on the street below and the frantic beating of my own heart, which felt like a trapped bird against my ribs. My father's face went from a triumphant flush to a sickly gray pallor as his eyes scanned the document, his hand trembling so violently that the champagne in his glass began to spill over the rim, staining the white silk tablecloth. My mother didn't even look at the paper. She looked at me, her eyes widening with a mixture of horror and a sudden, sharp recognition that she had finally pushed the quiet daughter too far. Every detail of their downfall was as sharp as a scalpel. The way Brianna's mouth hung open, a piece of lobster still on her fork, and the way Mr. Henderson at table 4 was suddenly trying to stand up and leave the room, only to find his path blocked by 2 men in dark suits who had entered through the main doors. I had timed the email to the authorities to ensure that their arrival would coincide with the climax of the evening, turning the Sterling Vaughn wedding into a federal crime scene in front of the very people my parents had spent decades trying to impress. The $15,000 worth of fairy lights now felt like the interrogation lamps in a police precinct, casting long, accusing shadows across the room as the reality of the forgery and the wire fraud began to sink in. I stood at the head of the room, the midnight blue of my blazer a stark contrast to the white and gold vanity of the ballroom, and I didn't feel a single shred of regret. I felt the weight of $18,450 in tuition debt lift off my shoulders, replaced by the heavy, solid certainty of justice. The guests were no longer looking at the bride. They were looking at the evidence, their eyes darting between the flyers and the terrified faces of the people who had invited them there. The family decision my father had bragged about was now a matter of public record, and the milestone my mother had prioritized over my education had become the tombstone of their reputation. I watched as the two investigators approached the head table, their badges glinting in the artificial light, and I realized that the $120,000 circus was finally coming to an end. My name is Sierra Sterling, and I was never meant to be a bridesmaid in this story. I was the auditor of their lies, the scientist who understood that you cannot build a life on a foundation of theft without eventually being buried by the rubble. As I turned to walk out of the ballroom, leaving the flyers scattered across the tables like the remains of a broken dream, I didn't look back at the sister who stole my money or the parents who stole my trust. I looked forward to the morning, to the quiet of a lab where the truth doesn't need fairy lights to be seen, and to a future that I would finally, truly own for myself. The paperwork they thought was trivial had just rewritten the entire history of our family, and for the first time in 22 years, I was the one holding the pen. I stepped onto the elevated band stage, the polished oak boards creaking slightly beneath my feet, and as I moved toward the center, the lead singer of the jazz quartet faltered, his saxophone trailing off into a confused, discordant note. I reached out and took the microphone from its stand, the cold metal an anchor in my trembling hand, and I looked out at the 280 faces that made up the social fabric of my parents' carefully curated world. The hum of the industrial air conditioning was the only sound in the room as I projected my voice into the cavernous, gold-leafed ceiling, stating with a calm, clinical authority that I needed everyone's attention for a special toast. I could see my father, Robert, half standing at the head table with his glass raised, his expression frozen in a mask of bewilderment that quickly curdled into a dark, panicked realization as I began to speak the truth. I told them all that I wanted to toast to the $75,612 that had paid for the very air they were breathing in this ballroom. But specifically, I wanted to toast to the fact that this money had been stolen from my deceased grandmother's restricted trust fund. I watched the color drain from the room as I explained, my voice amplified by the $10,000 sound system, that my mother had systematically forged my name on over a dozen withdrawal slips to fund this circus, while I was left with a past due tuition notice of $18,450. As I spoke, I began to reach into the heavy bag at my side and started throwing the stacks of printed flyers into the air, the high-gloss paper catching the light of the $15,000 fairy lights as they fluttered down onto the tables like a snowstorm of corporate evidence. I watched as people dropped their $12 silver-plated forks, the clatter of metal against china echoing through the silence like a series of small gunshots as the guests scrambled to pick up the documents. They weren't looking at the bride anymore. They were staring at high-resolution photocopies of my mother's flowery handwriting mimicking my signature and the grainy, time-stamped security stills from June 12th showing her laughing with Mr. Henderson as they processed the wire transfer. My mother's face, which had been a radiant, expensive tan only moments before, transformed into a ghostly, translucent white that made the diamonds around her neck look like heavy, cold stones. She didn't move, didn't speak, and didn't even try to reach for the glass of Pinot Grigio that was shaking in her hand as the socialites around her began to whisper and recoil, the stench of a federal crime suddenly overpowering the scent of the white peonies. The hyper-realism of the scene was intoxicating. The way the gold-leafed doors at the back of the ballroom looked so heavy and permanent right until they were pushed open by the two men in dark, nondescript suits. It was exactly 8:45 p.m., the precise moment I had coordinated with the white-collar crimes unit, and as the detectives walked through the entrance, the last remnants of the Sterling family's prestige vanished into the humid Philadelphia night. The detectives didn't look like the guests. They wore the faces of men who had seen every version of greed and narcissism, and they moved with a slow, deliberate purpose toward the head table where my parents sat paralyzed. I watched from the stage as they bypassed the state senator and the law firm partners, their eyes locked on my mother, Diane, who had finally dropped her glass, the wine soaking into the $26,000 Vera Wang gown of my sister, Brianna, who was now screaming in a high-pitched, hysterical tone that no one was bothering to comfort. I stood there, a 22-year-old biochemistry major in a midnight blue blazer, and I felt a sense of clarity that no laboratory experiment could ever provide. I watched my father try to use his country club voice to demand an explanation, his words stumbling over themselves as the detectives presented the warrant and the forensic handwriting analysis I had paid $850 to secure. The irony of the situation was a physical weight. My parents had spent $4,500 a year on lawn maintenance to ensure their neighbors respected them, but they hadn't spent a single second wondering if the daughter they were robbing was smart enough to document their downfall. The guests were now standing up, pushing back their silk-covered chairs and leaving their lobster dinners untouched, the room clearing with a frantic energy as they realized that being associated with the Sterlings was now a professional liability. Mr. Henderson, the bank manager who had processed the fraud, was being intercepted near the bar, his face a mottled purple as he realized his career and his freedom were being liquidated along with my trust fund. The silence that followed the initial chaos was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a house of cards finally collapsing under the weight of its own vanity. My mother was led out of the ballroom in handcuffs, the metal clicking shut over her Chanel bracelets with a finality that made the $15,000 lighting feel like a mockery of her former life. She didn't look at me as they walked her past the stage, her head bowed as the flashbulbs of several guests' phones captured the milestone she had so desperately wanted everyone to remember. My father followed, his expensive Italian suit rumpled and his face aged by 10 years in the span of 15 minutes, leaving Brianna standing alone amidst the wreckage of her wedding, her $400 hair extensions tangled and her sisterly love finally revealed as the transactional void it had always been. The $120,000 circus was over, the performers were in custody, and the only thing left was the paperwork. The beautiful, cold, undeniable paperwork that my mother had dismissed as a mere formality. I climbed down from the stage, my boots clicking on the floor that had been paid for with my senior year, and I walked past the deserted tables where the flyers still lay like accusations. I felt no pity for the woman who had forged my name or the man who had called my education a family decision, because I realized that they had never seen me as a person, but as a resource to be harvested for their own optics. As I stepped out into the lobby of the Ritz, leaving the screams and the sirens behind, I took a deep breath of the humid air and felt the last of the Sterling name fall away from me like a skin I had outgrown. I didn't need their money, and I certainly didn't need their approval. I had my 3.9 GPA, I had my forensic evidence, and I had the absolute certainty that I would never again be the quiet daughter who stayed out of the way. The financial canyon between us had been filled with the truth, and while my parents were being processed into a system that didn't care about their country club memberships, I was heading toward a future that was entirely my own. I thought about the 2009 Ford Focus parked in the garage and the $18,000 I still owed, but for the first time, those numbers didn't feel like a prison sentence. They felt like the price of my freedom, a debt I would gladly pay with the money I would earn as a scientist who knew exactly how to dismantle a lie. Family isn't about the blood in your veins or the signature on a trust fund. It's about the people who don't treat your life like a surplus to be spent on their own vanity. And as the police cars pulled away from the curb, their lights reflecting in the gilded windows of the hotel, I knew that for Sierra Sterling, the real work was only just beginning. I had turned my sister's big day into a federal crime scene because they left me no other choice, and as I walked toward the nearest bus stop, leaving the luxury behind, I realized that the most important paperwork I would ever sign was the one that officially ended my role in their theater. The milestone had been reached, the truth had been served, and the Sterlings would never be able to afford the cost of what they had lost tonight. The fallout from that humid August night at the Ritz-Carlton was nothing short of glorious. A systematic dismantling of a legacy built on the theft of my future that played out with the cold, satisfying precision of a chemical reaction reaching its inevitable conclusion. My mother, Diane Sterling, who once believed her social standing made her immune to the laws of the land, was formally charged with federal wire fraud and third-degree forgery, a reality that set in the moment the handcuffs clicked shut over her designer watch. Facing a mountain of evidence that included the forensic handwriting analysis I had funded and the damning security footage from Mr. Henderson's office, her high-priced legal team quickly realized that a trial would only broadcast her narcissism to a wider audience. She eventually took a plea deal that spared her a prison cell but stripped her of every ounce of the prestige she had spent decades cultivating, resulting in 24 months of intensive federal probation and 500 hours of community service, which she now spends cleaning local parks and municipal buildings. The woman who once refused to touch a silver-plated fork if it had a water spot is now required to wear a neon orange vest and pick up trash along the same highways where I used to drive my rattling 2009 Ford Focus. My father's downfall was equally swift and clinical, proving that the firm he dedicated his life to had no more loyalty to him than he had to me. Within 72 hours of the wedding scandal hitting the local papers, the senior partners issued a cold 2-sentence press release stating that Robert Sterling had been terminated effectively immediately to protect the firm's reputation and ethical standards. They didn't care about the 30 years of billable hours he had provided. They cared about the optics of a partner whose wife was a federal felon and whose daughter had been robbed of her grandmother's inheritance. He lost his corner office, his 6-figure bonuses, and the respect of the men he had called his brothers, finding himself suddenly persona non grata at the very country club where he had once spent $450 a month just to keep the grass perfect. The 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country was eventually repossessed when the secondary loans he had taken out to cover the wedding costs went into default, leaving him to navigate a world that no longer recognized his name or his status. The most poetic justice, however, was reserved for my sister, Brianna, whose fairy tale wedding ended not with a honeymoon in the Maldives, but with a mountain of debt and a legal nightmare that even her influencer filters couldn't hide. Because the funds my mother had stolen were frozen by the federal investigation, the Ritz-Carlton was left with an outstanding balance of $40,000 for the lobster dinner, the $15,000 in fairy lights, and the staff over time. Brianna, who had never known the value of a dollar she didn't take from someone else, was forced to sell her 4-carat diamond engagement ring to a private jeweler just to keep the venue from filing a civil lawsuit that would have sent her into immediate bankruptcy. Her husband, the junior law partner who had been so enamored with the Sterling prestige, found himself tied to a family in ruins, and the marriage that was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime milestone began to crumble under the weight of the very first bill they couldn't pay with stolen money. As for me, I moved out of the Rittenhouse Square estate the morning after the arrests, taking nothing but my clothes, my biochemistry textbooks, and the manila folder that had set me free. I found a quiet 600-square-foot apartment on the edge of the city, a space with peeling linoleum floors and a window that looks out over a brick alleyway, and it is the most beautiful home I have ever inhabited, because it was paid for with my own honest labor. The First National Bank, desperate to avoid a massive predatory negligence lawsuit for Mr. Henderson's role in the fraud, provided me with a full settlement that covered my outstanding $18,450 in tuition, my living expenses for the remainder of the year, and an additional sum that ensured I would never have to step foot in that greasy diner again. I finished my degree with my 3.9 GPA intact, walking across the stage at graduation without a single member of the Sterling family in the audience, and it was the proudest moment of my life to hear my name called and know that I was the one who had cleared the path to get there. I have blocked every single one of them, every phone number, every social media account, and every secondary email address they have used to try and beg for my forgiveness, or, more accurately, for my silence. I don't care about their excuses, and I don't care about the family decisions they claim were made in my best interest. I only care about the fact that for the first time in 22 years, I can breathe without feeling the suffocating weight of their expectations and their theft. The financial gap that used to be a canyon has been closed by the simple application of the truth, and while they sit in their shrinking world of probation meetings and debt collectors, I am looking toward a future in a research lab where the only thing that matters is the data. The hyper-realism of my new life is found in the silence of my apartment, the sound of a bubbling coffee maker in the morning, and the sight of my diploma hanging on the wall, a piece of paperwork that my mother said was worthless, but which I know is the most valuable thing I own. Every time I see a white peony or hear the faint sound of a string quartet, I am reminded of the night I stood on that stage and watched the Sterling Empire collapse, and I feel a sense of peace that is as solid as the foundations of the university I fought so hard to stay in. They thought I was a pushover, a secondary character in their drama, but they forgot that a scientist's job is to identify the poison in the system and neutralize it. I didn't just expose a secret. I conducted a surgery on my own life, removing the toxicity of a family that saw me as a resource rather than a daughter. The $120,000 circus is over, the lights have been turned off, and the only person left standing is the girl they thought they could erase with a forged signature. My grandmother, Margaret, would have been proud of the way I used her legacy, not for a party or a dress, but to secure the dignity she always wanted for me. She knew that family isn't about the name on a trust fund or the blood in your veins. It is about the respect you show to the truth and the boundaries you set against those who would steal your light to brighten their own. I am 22 years old. I am a biochemist, and I am finally, undeniably, the only person who holds the pen to my own story. The Sterlings wanted a day that no one would ever forget, and I made sure they got exactly that. A milestone of accountability that will resonate in their empty hallways for the rest of their lives. I don't need their luxury or their country club image. I have my integrity, my apartment, and a future that belongs to no one but me. The paperwork is finished, the account is settled, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I sit here in the quiet of my new life, I realize that the only person who truly stayed for me was myself. That is not just a moral. It is the most important fact I have ever discovered. Family is the person who fights for your right to exist, and if you have to be that person for yourself, then you have already won the most important battle of all. My name is Sierra Sterling, and I am done being a secret. I am the truth that survived.